So, imagine for a second being the undisputed ruler of the known world.
Are
You have the greatest military on the face of the earth, right? You've conquered literally all your enemies. Your legions are just, marching across continents, enforcing your will
We're
everywhere.
at the absolute peak of power.
Yeah. And yet you spend your evenings desperately trying to learn your defeated enemy's language
Hmm.
because you are absolutely terrified they secretly think you're a savage.
So backwards.
It is. But that was the Roman Empire. I mean, the conquerors of the Mediterranean were suffering from this massive cultural imposter syndrome, and it all revolved around one single mocking word.
It's a stunning historical reality, honestly. You had this massive geopolitical powerhouse, Rome, essentially bowing down to the cultural ghost of Greece.
Yeah,
And they were just desperate to avoid a label that, well, it started out as a literal playground taunt.
it did. And welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is our custom-tailored deep dive, and today we are unpacking a concept that defined the ancient world. And honestly, it continues to dictate how human beings draw lines between us and them, even today.
Absolutely.
We're looking at the Greek word barbaros, which is, the direct root of our modern word barbarian. So if you are a student of history, or if you're reading the New Testament, or if you are simply fascinated by the psychological walls societies build to protect their own egos, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you see the world.
Yeah, and what becomes immediately apparent when you look at the historical timeline of this word is just the staggering irony of its progression.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the word barbarian begins as a joke about stuttering birds.
Right.
Then it morphs into a weapon of massive cultural superiority used to justify slavery and empire. And finally, early Christian writers turn the entire concept upside down to level the human playing field.
They just flip the script.
They do. It tracks the complete arc of human pride and divine grace.
So let's start at the very beginning. Part one of our discussion is really about the actual sound of the outsider. Because before Barbaros was a geopolitical identity, before it was some philosophical category, it was literally just a noise.
Yeah, just a sound.
The etymology here is so fascinating because the word is an onomatopoeia. It just mimics the sound of stammering, bar.
Yes, and it's so crucial to recognize that in its earliest usage, the term carried zero moral weight. None. It was a purely descriptive, phonetic label.
It just meant you didn't speak Greek.
Spot on. It describes someone who spoke an unintelligible non-Greek language. To really get this, you had to put yourself in the mindset of the ancient Greeks. They possessed an immense, blinding pride in their language.
I mean, Greek was a language of poetry, of commerce, of high philosophy.
Right. So to the Greek ear, anyone speaking a foreign tongue didn't sound like they were conveying complex thoughts. They sounded like they were just repeating nonsense syllables.
They just heard bar. It makes me think of Aristophanes and Aeschylus. Both of these massive figures in Greek theater use this specific root word to describe the twittering of birds.
Yes, they did.
Like in Aristophanes' famous comedy, The Birds, the chorus of birds is described using the barbaros root.
That phonetic association was incredibly common. The historian Herodotus provides a really perfect illustration of this when he writes about the oracle at Dodona.
Oh, right.
Now, Dodona was one of the oldest and most revered oracles in Greece. People would travel there from all over to hear the priestesses deliver divine messages. But Herodotus notes this strange detail. The local population referred to these priestesses as doves.
And not because they were, peaceful or flying around, right?
Nope. Herodotus explains that these priestesses were originally foreigners. They were brought to the region, and before they learned to speak Greek properly, their strange foreign speech sounded to the locals like the chattering of birds. They were just making bar noises. So the locals named them doves. It was a completely dismissive way of interpreting human communication.
You see something similar in Homer's Iliad, actually. He uses a variation of the word barbarophonon to describe the Carians who fought alongside the Trojans. He's specifically highlighting their harsh, unintelligible speech.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating how isolating language can be. When human beings cannot understand one another, the default mechanism is almost never patience.
Definitely not.
We don't naturally pause and try to, decode the syntax. The default biological instinct is to reduce the foreign speech to animalistic noise.
It's a defense mechanism, really. It protects the ego of the listener. If I can't understand you, the problem can't possibly be my own ignorance.
Obviously not.
The problem must be that you aren't actually saying anything meaningful. By categorizing foreign speech as animal noise, the Greek listener maintained their own intellectual supremacy.
You know, for you, the listener, you've probably experienced a version of this instinct yourself. Think about being a kid on a playground, listening to adults or other kids speak a foreign language. Kids will naturally mock the cadence with nonsense syllables.
Huh?
They'll go bork, 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 or mimic the vowel sounds in a highly exaggerated way. It's a universal human reflex to label what we can't comprehend as gibberish. It's the exact same phonetic border wall the Greeks built thousands of years ago.
And we know this is a universal human trait because the linguistics extend far beyond Greece. There's a direct connection to ancient Sanskrit.
Really?
Yeah. The word Barbara in Sanskrit also means stammering, and it was used to describe non-Aryan people.
Wait, so the Aryans in ancient India were doing the exact same thing to the indigenous populations they encountered?
They were. The Aryans possessed a highly developed language, which eventually became classical Sanskrit, and they looked at the indigenous tribes and essentially said, well, we speak the language of the gods, and you stammer. It's a boundary drawing exercise that happens across the globe. You identify the insider by their mastery of the dominant language, and you identify the outsider by their perceived phonetic failures.
But making fun of someone's accent is one thing. Turning that linguistic observation into a tool for geopolitical domination is something else entirely. And that brings us to the evolution of the word. The Greeks didn't stop at making fun of foreign languages.
Oh, they took it much further.
They took the word barbaros and turned it into a rigid, impenetrable wall between Hellas, the Greek world, and everybody else.
This is where the word absorbs a massive amount of moral and intellectual baggage. The dividing line between Hellenes and Barbaroi became the defining feature of the ancient worldview.
Right.
The Greeks no longer just thought barbarians sounded funny. They began to believe that because these people didn't speak Greek, they were inherently poor in culture, wild, uneducated, and fierce. The word shifted from person who speaks a different language to, essentially, savage.
So how deep did this arrogance go? Was it just a casual stereotype among the common people, or was it baked into their highest philosophy?
Oh, it was completely baked into the highest echelons of their intellectual life. To understand the scale of this cultural pride, you have to look at the ancient philosopher Thales.
Okay.
He was one of the seven sages of Greece, a huge figure in philosophy and mathematics, and there's a famous prayer attributed to him that perfectly captures the ancient hierarchy. Thales prayed, thanking fortune for three specific things.
And those three things are just shocking to modern ears.
They really are. He thanked fortune that he was born a human and not a beast,
Okay.
a man and not a woman,
Wow.
and a Greek and not a barbarian.
Let's just pause and look at those pairings. Human over beast, man over woman, Greek over barbarian. He is equating the gap between a Greek and a foreigner to the gap between a human being and an animal.
That is the crucial takeaway. In the classical Greek mindset, to be a barbarian was to exist closer to a beast than to a civilized human. And this wasn't a fringe extremist view.
Yeah.
This was the mainstream consensus of the greatest minds of the era. Aristotle, the father of Western logic, and Euripides, the legendary playwright, actively argued that it was the natural order of the universe for Greeks to rule over barbarians.
Because they believed barbarians were essentially slaves by nature. That is a horrifying concept. Slaves by nature. It implies that your DNA, your very essence, dictates that you exist solely to serve someone with better philosophy and better architecture.
If we pull back and look at the psychological mechanism at work here, it's terrifyingly common. Human beings naturally elevate their own cultural achievements.
Yeah.
The Greeks looked at their democracy, their theater, their sculptures, and their philosophical schools. They decided that these specific cultural outputs were the absolute peak of human existence. Therefore, they assumed that anyone lacking those specific outputs lacked fundamental human worth.
We confuse our technological or artistic achievements with intrinsic human value.
Absolutely. We do it all the time.
We use our own specific strength as the universal measuring stick for human dignity. If our culture values logic, we say the emotional culture is barbaric. If our culture values military discipline, we say the artistic culture is barbaric. The Greeks set the rules of the game so that only they could win.
Spot on. But maintaining that illusion of supremacy required constant paranoia, because a boundary built on culture is incredibly fragile. If you define your humanity by your language and your education, what happens if you lose your language and your education?
Right, and this is where the historical record gets fascinating, because the Greeks were actually terrified of this happening. They knew the wall wasn't permanent. Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote extensively about this fear.
He did.
He described Greeks who lived in foreign lands, surrounded by non-Greek speakers who eventually forgot how to speak Greek.
The terror of assimilation. Dionysius is describing a cultural nightmare for the ancient Greek mind. These colonists spent so much time among the Barbaroi that they unlearned their Greekness. They forgot the language, they adopted foreign customs, and in the eyes of the mainland Greeks, they essentially devolved.
It's the ancient equivalent of going native. You see this in the colonial eras of the 18th and 19th centuries. The British Empire had this massive paranoia about officers stationed in India or Africa losing their Britishness.
Oh, yes.
They would demand that officers drink tea at specific times and wear wool uniforms in the sweltering jungle heat just to maintain the psychological boundary. For the ancient Greeks, there was an absolute terror of slipping back into the Babel. It proves that they knew civilization, as they defined it, was a fragile construct.
It was a construct that required massive daily reinforcement. The Greeks had to constantly convince themselves that their way of life was the only valid way of life.
Yeah.
And for a long time, the Mediterranean map allowed them to maintain that illusion.
Because everyone stayed in their lane.
Yeah. The Greeks stayed in their city-states, the barbarians stayed outside, and the boundary held.
But then a young Macedonian king decided to change the map of the world, Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great is the massive pivot point in this historical timeline. He sweeps out of Macedonia, conquers Greece, and then proceeds to conquer the entire known world, pushing all the way into India. And his military conquest brought something completely unprecedented.
It was
The aggressive, intentional spread of Hellenism.
Hellenization. He don't just want to tax the people he conquered, he wanted to turn them into Greeks.
Precisely. Alexander's strategy was cultural domination on a global scale. He built Greek cities everywhere he went. I mean, he named dozens of them Alexandria.
Very humble.
Very. He established Greek gymnasiums, forced the local elites to learn the Greek language, and spread Greek philosophy from Egypt to Persia. Plutarch, writing centuries later, described Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as a divinely sent reconciler who destroyed the enmity between Greeks and barbarians.
By forcing the barbarians to become Greek. It's a very specific type of reconciliation. We can be friends as long as you act exactly like me.
It's assimilation at the point of a sword. But it created a massive philosophical crisis back home. Because suddenly you have Egyptians speaking perfect Greek. You have Persians studying Plato. The rigid boundary between Greek and barbarian started to blur.
So the intellectuals had to respond.
Yeah. Intellectuals like the sophist Antiphon started arguing that Greeks and barbarians are entirely alike by nature. They observed that a Persian bleeds the same way a Spartan bleeds. They both laugh, they both cry, they both need food. The biological reality started to break down the cultural wall.
So the massive expansion of the empire forced the Greek mind to reckon with the actual humanity of the people they were subjugating. But here is the most fascinating fallout of Alexander's world: the Roman imposter syndrome.
This is one of the great ironies of Western history. Fast forward a couple of centuries, Rome rises. Rome defeats the descendants of Alexander's generals. Rome conquers Greece militarily. The Roman legions are the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. But technically speaking, according to the strict Greek definition we've been discussing, the Romans were barbarians.
Wow.
They didn't speak Greek, they spoke Latin. They didn't have a massive history of philosophy, they had a history of farming and fighting.
It's like a corporate takeover. Imagine a massive, wealthy tech company buying out a small, boutique design firm. The tech company has all the money and all the power, but the executives at the tech company secretly feel incredibly uncool.
Yeah, that's a great way to picture it.
So they start wearing the boutique firm's merchandise and copying their office layout, desperate to be accepted by the very people they just bought. The Romans had the swords, but the Greeks owned the cultural real estate.
That is a brilliant analogy. The Romans suffered from a huge inferiority complex. They possessed the military might to crush any Greek city-state that rebelled, but they desperately wanted the cultural validation of the people they crushed. To avoid the label of Barbaros, the Roman elites engaged in an aggressive campaign of self-Hellenization.
They just absorbed it all.
They really did. They hired Greek tutors for their children. It became a status symbol in Rome to speak Greek fluently. They imported Greek architecture, copied Greek statues, and Roman poets spent their lives trying to mimic Greek poetic meters.
All to prove they belonged at the civilized table? It proves that the psychological weight of a cultural label can actually be more intimidating than a physical army.
And you see the sheer pain of this label in the life of Ovid.
Oh, yes.
Ovid was one of the greatest poets in Roman history. He was a master of the Latin language, an absolute celebrity in Rome. But he runs afoul of the Emperor Augustus and Augustus exiles him to the far shores of the Black Sea, to a town called Thomas, surrounded by the Getae tribe.
He's sent to the very edge of the map.
Yes. And while in exile, Ovid writes letters back to Rome, and he pens this heartbreaking, deeply ironic line. He writes, "I am a barbarous here because no one understands me."
The master of Latin poetry, the man who could manipulate language better than almost anyone alive, is reduced to a babbling outsider. He's making the barbar noises to the locals, and the locals are laughing at him.
He experiences the total inversion of the word. He realizes that barbarian is not a biological reality. It's just a matter of geography and local consensus. If you're in Rome, the Getae are the barbarians. If you're in Thomas, Ovid is the barbarian.
Which brings up a very interesting point about how later movements handled this insult. Because I know that early Christian writers eventually had to deal with Greek intellectuals mocking them.
Right.
I mean, Christianity started with a crucified Jewish carpenter in a Roman backwater. To the sophisticated Athenians, the entire Christian message sounded like uncultured babble. But didn't early Christianity just adopt the existing social ladders to survive? Didn't they try to prove how Greek and philosophical they were?
Some certainly tried, but the most striking response came from apologists who weaponized the insult. Think about men like Tatian and Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. Greek philosophers were mocking the Christian faith because it lacked the polished rhetoric of Aristotle or Plato. It was considered a barbarian religion.
And how did they respond?
They owned it. Tatian essentially writes back and says, "You are absolutely right. Our teachings are barbarian. We don't use your fancy rhetorical tricks, but our barbarian teachings are older, truer, and infinitely more virtuous than your so-called civilized philosophy."
I love that.
He points out that Greek philosophers engaged in terrible moral behavior while claiming intellectual superiority, whereas the simple barbarian Christians were actually living lives of genuine virtue. They took the insult, claimed it as a badge of honor, and used it to completely dismantle Greek arrogance.
It's an incredible rhetorical judo flip. But while the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually the early Christians were fighting over who gets to hold the civilized title, there was an entire population living right in the middle of this mess who had a totally different way of measuring human value. And that brings us to the Jewish dilemma.
This is a vital piece of the puzzle. The Jewish people lived under Greek rule and then under Roman rule. They were constantly dealing with this Hellenized world. But their internal categories of insider and outsider were not based on language, and they weren't based on philosophy.
They were based on covenant.
Exactly. I mean, yes, absolutely. The Greek divide was based on human intellect and culture. The Jewish divide was based on divine revelation and God's covenant with Abraham. It was Israel versus the nations, the Goyim.
Right.
So when Jewish scholars sitting in Alexandria, Egypt, decided to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a translation we call the Septuagint or the LXX, they faced a massive linguistic problem. What do they do with the Greek word barbaros?
When you look at the Septuagint, they actually used it very sparingly. For a massive translation project, the word only shows up twice in the canonical text.
And those two instances perfectly capture the dual meaning the word had acquired. The first is in Psalm 114.1, which describes Israel coming out of Egypt, people of strange speech.
So they use it in the old phonetic sense. The Egyptians speak a language Israel doesn't understand.
Right, a purely linguistic barrier.
Yeah.
But the second usage is in Ezekiel 21.31, which talks about God handing Jerusalem over to brutal, violent men. There, the Greek translators use barbaros to describe violent, uncultured destroyers.
They use the moral, pejorative sense of the word.
Yeah. We see this continue in the Apocrypha, in books like Maccabees, where foreign enemies and cruel tyrants like Antiochus Epiphanes are labeled barbarians because of their savagery toward the Jewish people.
But the tension really ramps up when you look at the Jewish intellectuals of the diaspora, people like Philo of Alexandria. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the Greek world. It had the great library. To be a Jewish scholar in Alexandria meant you were constantly feeling the gravity of Greek culture.
Philo is a fascinating case study in how marginalized groups try to handle dominant cultures. Philo wrote in beautiful, highly sophisticated philosophical Greek. He desperately wanted the Greek intellectual world to respect the Jewish faith. So he actually adopted the Greek usage. He divided the world into Greeks and barbarians in his writings.
He used their categories. That seems like a massive compromise.
It was a compromise, but he added a brilliant twist. He agreed with the Greeks that the world was divided into the civilized and the barbaric, but he argued that the Jewish law, the Torah given by God, was the only force on Earth that could actually heal the diseases of both Greeks and barbarians.
Ah, I see. He's threading the needle, he's using their arrogant categories to get their attention, but then he places Jewish divine revelations supreme over both of them. It's a very clever apologetic strategy.
It is. We see a different strategy with Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian, writing after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. He was writing primarily for a Roman audience, trying to explain Jewish history to the people who just burned Jerusalem to the ground.
That's a tough crowd.
Very tough. Josephus's main goal was to prove to the Romans that the Jews were an ancient, noble, and civilized people. He wanted to explicitly exclude the Jewish people from the barbarian category. He went out of his way to highlight Jewish antiquities and philosophy. However, he made a very political calculation regarding the Jewish populations living outside the Roman Empire, over in the Parthian Empire.
The Parthians were Rome's great rivals in the East.
Yes. So Josephus, trying to keep his Roman patrons happy, awkwardly refers to the Parthian Jews as upper barbarians.
Oh, man. He threw his own people under the bus to look good for the Romans.
He essentially did. It shows the intense pressure to conform to the dominant cultural narrative. If the Romans hate the Parthians and consider them barbarians, Josephus is willing to adopt that label for the Parthian Jews just to secure his own standing as a civilized historian in Rome.
Why does the human brain do this? We see this constantly throughout history. Marginalized groups often adopt the very insults used against them and apply those insults to other subgroups just to gain proximity to power.
It's the sociology of survival. When you are surrounded by a dominant, arrogant culture that holds all the economic and military leverage, there is an immense temptation to gentrify your own mind. You want to prove you're one of the good ones. You scrub the perceived crudeness off yourself to secure a seat at the table.
You actually see this explicitly in the letter of Aristus. This is an ancient text that tells the legend of how the Septuagint was translated. It describes the 72 Jewish elders who were brought to Egypt to translate the Hebrew Bible. And the author makes a very specific point to assure the reader that these Jewish elders had completely shed the crudity and barbarian nature of their thought.
That phrase is a striking admission. The author is bending over backwards to appease the Greek gaze. He's saying, please don't dismiss our holy book. The men who translated it weren't backward, tribal peasants. They were highly educated. They have scrubbed the barbarian off themselves. They think like Greeks. It's an incredibly defensive posture.
Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem and the Rabbinic academies, the perspective was entirely different, right?
Entirely different. The rabbis didn't care about impressing the Greeks or the Romans. They used the word Barbaros simply as a loanword to describe foreign conquering empires, specifically Rome, or to describe violently uncultured individuals. But their worldview remained strictly covenantal. The wall wasn't about who read Homer or who read Latin. The wall was about who was part of the covenant of Israel.
But humans, being humans, they managed to add their own layer of pride to that divine covenant. The historical records show that the rabbis developed their own version of Thales' prayer.
Yes, the three Beatitudes of Rabbi Meir, which became a standard part of daily prayer. A Jewish man would thank God that he was not made a Gentile, a woman, or a fool, and some textual variations substitute the word barbarian for fool.
It's the exact same psychological structure as the Greek philosopher, just substituting covenant status for cultural status, human over beast, man over woman, Israelite over Gentile.
It proves that regardless of the metric, whether it is language, philosophy, or even access to divine revelation, the human heart desperately wants to build a hierarchy where it sits comfortably at the top, looking down on the babbling masses below. Every culture, every religion, every empire demand a barbarian to feel good about itself.
Which brings us to the absolute explosion of this concept. We've spent all this time building up the historical baggage, the mocking of foreign speech, the massive cultural arrogance of the Greeks, the painful identity crises of the Romans, the covenantal superiority of the Jewish elites, thousands of years of humanity building thicker and taller walls. And then we hit the New Testament. And the writers of the New Testament take this loaded, heavy, blood-soaked weapon of a word and completely systematically dismantle it.
It's one of the most radical linguistic subversions in ancient history. The early Christians, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, look at this massive cultural wall and pull the foundation completely out from under it.
Let's start with the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 11. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. Now, Corinth is a Greek city. It's wealthy, it's cosmopolitan, and the people there are incredibly proud of their Greek heritage and their sophisticated rhetoric. Paul is writing to them about spiritual gifts, specifically addressing the chaotic use of speaking in uninterpreted tongues during their worship gatherings. And he says this, If I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker is a foreigner to me. But the Greek word he uses for foreigner is barbaros.
Paul does two things simultaneously here. First, he returns the word to its original neutral linguistic root. He strips away the moral baggage of savage or uncultured and uses it to simply mean someone who speaks a language you don't understand. But second, and far more radically, he makes the label a two-way street.
The Greek is just as much a barbarian to the foreigner as the foreigner is to the Greek.
Yeah. Imagine how that landed on the ears of a proud Corinthian. They had spent their entire lives believing that if communication failed, it was because the other person was an ignorant barbarian. Paul says, no. If you are speaking a language nobody understands, you are the barbarian in the room. He completely strips away their cultural superiority.
It makes me think of two people trying to communicate on completely different radio frequencies. You have one guy broadcasting on AM and another guy listening on FM. The guy on AM radio isn't morally or intellectually superior to the guy on FM radio. They're just failing to connect. Neither has the high ground. They're both equally isolated. Paul takes away the high ground.
That equalizing force is a hallmark of New Testament theology. We see Paul doing it philosophically in his letters, but we also see it play out narratively in the book of Acts.
Oh, the shipwreck on Malta. This
Yeah.
is Acts chapter 28. It's such a brilliant piece of writing. Paul has been arrested by the Romans. He's being transported across the Mediterranean Sea as a prisoner to stand trial before Caesar. A massive storm hits, the ship is torn apart, and Paul and the crew wash up on the shore of a small island called Malta.
Now, Luke is the author of Acts. He's a highly educated physician, writing in excellent Greek, and he notes that the native people of Malta spoke a Punic dialect. So naturally, Luke uses the standard Greek term for them. He calls them barbaroi.
But then Luke pulls off this incredible narrative trick. He uses the derogatory label, but look at the action he describes. Verse 2 says, these barbaros showed them unusual kindness. The Greek word is philanthropia,
Right.
literally the love of humanity.
Think about the massive contrast Luke is setting up for the reader. Let's look at the track record of the civilized world in Paul's life. The Jewish religious elites, the guardians of the law, handed him over to be killed. The Greeks, the masters of philosophy, mocked him in Athens.
Yeah.
The Romans, the pinnacle of law and justice, kept him in chains for years without a fair trial, ignored his warnings about the weather, and navigated him well, steered him into a catastrophic shipwreck. The absolute zenith of human civilization produced injustice, violence, and disaster.
The peak of human achievement tried to kill him.
Yes, and who rescues him? The uneducated, uncultured, Punic-speaking natives on a beach, the so-called wild barbarians, are the ones who build a fire, welcome the shivering Roman soldiers and prisoners, and show genuine philanthropia.
For you, the listener, this completely short-circuits the ancient hierarchy. It forces a total reevaluation of who actually holds moral authority. The sophisticated, educated systems of the ancient world failed to produce basic human decency. The uneducated locals provided warmth and rescue. It turns the entire diagnostic machine back on the Greeks and Romans. It asks, who is the real savage here?
It proves that education and cultural refinement do not equal morality. You can have the best philosophy in the world and still be a monster. You can be entirely ignorant of classical literature and still possess huge human compassion. Luke dismantles the idea that culture produces virtue.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the theological core of how the New Testament handles this concept. Romans chapter 1, verse 14. This is arguably the most famous theological treatise ever written, and Paul uses the word right in the introduction. He writes, I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish.
This is a staggering statement of universal need. Paul takes the entire non-Jewish world, the sophisticated elites studying rhetoric in Rome and Athens, and the uncultured, illiterate tribes living in the forests of Germania, and places them on the exact same footing.
They are all equally in need of the gospel. Spot on. Paul is declaring that human culture offers absolutely zero advantage when it comes to standing before a holy God. The Greek philosopher cannot reason his way into heaven using Aristotle. And the barbarian is not disqualified from grace because he lacks a formal education. Before the absolute holiness of God, human cultural achievements are completely flattened. The playing field is entirely level because everyone is equally bankrupt.
This cuts right to the heart of Reformed theology, even without using all the academic jargon. It's the concept of total spiritual inability. But I want to focus on a specific word Paul uses here because I think it's the key to understanding his motivation. He says he is a debtor to them. He owes them something. Why does Paul, a man who has been beaten and mocked by both Greeks and barbarians, consider himself in debt to people he has never even met? Because Paul really understands the mechanics of grace. Grace creates an obligation. Think about Paul's own life. Before his conversion, he had the ultimate religious and cultural resume. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He was educated under the greatest rabbis of his day. By every human metric, he was at the absolute top of the civilized, covenantal pyramid.
Yet he was using all that education to hunt down and murder innocent Christians. He was completely spiritually dead.
Precisely. His flawless resume did not save him. His salvation on the road to Damascus was an act of pure, unmerited grace. God intervened in his life when he deserved absolute judgment. When you realize that your own rescue was completely independent of your merit, that your education, your culture, your good deeds contributed nothing to your salvation, it fundamentally changes how you view other people.
Because if my resume didn't save me, I can't demand a resume from anyone else.
Yes. Paul realizes he has no right to withhold the message of rescue from anyone based on their lack of merit. He owes the gospel to the sophisticated Greeks and the illiterate barbarians because the God who saved Paul did so without looking at his cultural pedigree. The debt is owed to God, but it is paid out to humanity.
That is a staggering reality check for anyone who claims to follow this faith. It means that looking down on someone because of their lack of education, their social class, or their lack of refinement is not just arrogant, it is actually a denial of the gospel itself. If you look down on a barbarian, you are essentially saying that your own refinement is what makes you acceptable to God. You are denying the premise that we are all equally bankrupt.
Which leads us directly to the climax of the word's usage, the ultimate leveling of the human race. This is Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Paul is writing to a church made up of diverse backgrounds, and he gives them the ultimate vision of what humanity looks like under the authority of Christ.
He writes, "Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all."
Let's unpack the four pairs Paul uses in this verse, because he is systematically taking a sledgehammer to every single wall the ancient world had built. First, he addresses the religious and covenantal divide. Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, the wall that defined the rabbinic worldview.
Completely neutralize.
Second, he addresses the societal and economic divide, slave and free. This was the most rigid, immovable hierarchy of daily life in the Roman Empire. You were either property or you owned property.
Neutralized.
Third, he addresses the cultural divide, but notice something very specific here. Paul doesn't just use the standard pairing. He doesn't just say Greek and barbarian. He says barbarian and Scythian.
Let's dig into that. Why the Scythians? Who were they? And why does Paul single them out in this list?
To fully grasp the weight of this verse, you have to understand the sheer terror the word Scythian struck into the ancient Greco-Roman heart. The Scythians were a massive confederation of nomadic tribes that roamed the Eurasian steppes. In the classical mindset, if a normal barbarian was uncultured, a Scythian was a living nightmare. They were the bogeymen of the ancient world.
How bad were they?
The historian Herodotus dedicated extensive writings to describing their brutality. They fought entirely on horseback, striking without warning and vanishing into the plains. They were famous for scalping their defeated enemies and using the scalps as napkins or sewing them into cloaks. They would literally cut off the tops of the skulls of their most hated enemies, line the inside with leather or gold, and use them as drinking cups during feasts.
Good grief. They were essentially the ancient equivalent of a post-apocalyptic raider gang.
They were viewed as the absolute extreme edge of human depravity. They were bloodthirsty, chaotic, and entirely beyond the reach of civilization or reason. To a Roman citizen or a Greek philosopher, a Scythian was barely human.
So, by putting them in this specific list, Paul is taking the absolute extremes of human civilization and forcing them into the same room.
Yes. Picture the contrast. On one side, you have the sophisticated Greek philosopher wearing a pristine white toga, sitting in a marble courtyard in Athens, debating the finer points of ethics and virtue. On the other side, you have the wild Scythian nomad, covered in dirt and blood, drinking fermented mare's milk out of a human skull.
The highest peak of culture and the deepest valley of savagery.
And Paul says that in Christ, both of these men are perfectly equal. The Greek's philosophy cannot buy him an ounce of grace, and the Scythian's savagery cannot place him beyond the reach of grace. They are perfectly equal in their absolute need for a Savior, and if they believe, they have perfect equal standing in the kingdom of God.
That shatters the ancient world's most rigid hierarchy. It's the ultimate diagnostic check on the human condition. When God looks at humanity, He doesn't see a Greek bone structure or a Scythian bone structure. He doesn't see a refined cultural output or a barbaric cultural output. He just sees dead bones that need resurrection.
It proves that human culture, while it's fully capable of producing beautiful art, stable governments, and incredible poetry, has absolutely zero currency in the economy of salvation. Your culture cannot save you, and your lack of culture cannot condemn you. The ground at the foot of the cross is completely level. Christ is all and in all.
So let's bring this massive historical arc to a close. We started with a word, Barbaros, that was just a phonetic observation, a playground taunt about bird-like babbling. Bar, bar, bar.
Then we watched the Greeks turn that simple sound into a geopolitical weapon, using it to justify their natural right to rule the world and enslave those they deemed inferior.
We saw it cause massive psychological crises for the Romans, who conquered the world but felt intellectually inferior, and for the Jewish elites in Alexandria, who tried to translate their holy texts without losing their dignity in the eyes of their conquerors.
And finally, we saw the writers of the New Testament completely dismantle the word. They recognized that all human pride, whether built on language, intellect, or covenant status, falls entirely flat before God. They took the ultimate insult, claimed it, and used it to prove that divine grace operates entirely outside of human hierarchies.
Which leaves us with a very direct, slightly uncomfortable question for you, the listener. Because while the word Barbaros might be ancient Greek history, the psychological mechanism is alive and well. We haven't stopped doing this. We all still have our barbarians today.
We absolutely do. The instinct to build a wall and put ourselves on the civilized side of it is a permanent feature of fallen human nature.
Think about your daily life. We all encounter groups of people whose political language, social priorities, or religious convictions sound like unintelligible babble to us. We hear someone from a different political party, or someone from a different geographical region with a thick accent, or someone who didn't go to college, and our brains instantly go, bar, bar, bar.
We reduce their genuine concerns, their fears, and their lived experiences to gibberish because it protects our own sense of superiority. If they're just babbling, we don't have to engage with them. We don't have to treat them as equals.
We elevate our specific cultural outputs, our degrees, our voting records, our theological vocabularies, and assume that anyone lacking those specific things is intrinsically less valuable, less intelligent, and less worthy of respect.
Which is why tracing this history is so vital for our modern context. If the ancient Greeks used classical education and language to blind themselves to their shared humanity, what are the modern metrics you use to draw the line between the civilized and the barbarian in your own life? Is it the car someone drives? Is it the news channel they watch? Is it the way they pronounce certain words?
And more to the point, how might looking through the lens of radical equalizing grace force you to see the modern Scythians in your life as absolute equals? If we truly grasp the theology of Romans 1 and Colossians 3, if we really believe that our own standing before God is entirely unearned, a sheer gift of grace to a spiritually bankrupt sinner, it must utterly destroy our right to look down on anyone else.
We are all debtors. The sophisticated executive and the unhoused addict are sitting on the exact same level ground. Grace leaves no room for cultural arrogance.
That is a phenomenal place to land today. It completely reframes how we listen to the voices we usually tune out. We have to stop hearing babble and start recognizing a shared humanity and a shared need for grace. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources here on Reformed Thinking. Keep questioning the labels you use, keep listening past the accents, and we will catch you next time.